A millionaire found his missing mother being pushed in a shopping cart by a homeless young man, and what he discovered next brought him to tears. Michael Carter slammed on the brakes so hard his tires screamed against the wet Cleveland asphalt. For one full second, his brain refused to process what his eyes were showing him. There on the corner of East 55th and Kinsman, a thin, hunched woman sat curled up inside a rusted shopping cart, being pushed slowly down the sidewalk by a young man in torn clothes. It couldn't be. It couldn't possibly be her. But it was. It was his mother, Diane Carter, missing for 9 agonizing days. Michael didn't remember opening the car door. He didn't remember leaving the engine running in the middle of the street, hazard lights forgotten, other drivers laying on their horns behind him. His legs simply moved on their own, carrying him toward the cart while his mind spun in frantic circles, refusing to accept what stood right in front of him. This was the woman who raised him alone after his father died of a heart attack when Michael was 11. This was the woman who worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables at a diner on weekends, taking in sewing work after midnight, just so he could stay in school instead of dropping out to help pay rent. This was the woman he swore, the very day his first company sold for 8 figures, that he would take care of for the rest of her life. And now here she was, filthy, dangerously thin, folded into a shopping cart like she was nothing more than scraps someone had left out for the truck. The young man pushing the cart stopped cold the moment he saw Michael coming. His whole body went rigid, eyes wide, watching this stranger in an expensive suit storm toward him, with his jaw clenched and his fists already curling shut. Michael felt the rage crawl up his throat, hot and bitter, because this stranger, this kid, had his mother. His mother was with him, and Michael had no idea if this was a kidnapping, if she was being held against her will, if this kid had done something to her, hurt her, used her. When he closed the last few feet between them, he grabbed a fistful of the young man's torn shirt and shouted with everything he had. "What did you do to her? What the hell did you do to my mother?" The young man didn't fight back. He didn't try to pull away or throw a punch. He just looked at Michael with tired, sunken eyes that carried a sadness far too old for someone his age, and answered in a low, hoarse voice, "I didn't do anything, man. I've just been taking care of her." Michael let go of the shirt and dropped to his knees beside the cart, not caring that his $3,000 suit was soaking up filth from the sidewalk. He took his mother's hands in his own. They were cold and trembling, and when she lifted her face to look at him, Michael felt the ground fall away beneath him, because there was no recognition in her eyes, none of that familiar warmth, that glow of love she'd always had for him, just a frightening emptiness that made his chest ache in a way he had never felt before in his life. "Mom, it's me, it's Michael, your son. Don't you recognize me?" Diane blinked slowly. Her mouth moved like she was trying to form words, but nothing came out. After a silence that stretched unbearably long, she murmured something so faint that Michael had to lean in close just to catch it. "Michael, my boy." Her voice was thin, cracked, barely a whisper, but it was her voice, and Michael couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled down his face as he squeezed her hands tighter, trying to pull her back, trying to make her remember who he was, who they were to each other. "Yes, Mom, it's me. I'm here now. I'm taking you home." He turned toward the young man who stood quietly off to the side, head down, and the anger came rushing back, tangled now with a confusion Michael couldn't quite name. "How did she end up with you? Where did you find her? Talk now." The young man took a deep breath, wiped the sweat off his face with the back of a filthy hand, and started speaking slowly, choosing each word like he was afraid of getting one wrong. "I found her 6 days ago, real early in the morning, out behind the recycling center off St. Clair. She was on the ground, all banged up, confused, talking to herself. I figured she'd die out there if I didn't do something." Michael's stomach turned over. The image of his mother collapsed behind a recycling plant flashed through his head like something out of a nightmare, and he had to fight the urge to scream, to punch something, to break the whole world in half. "Why didn't you take her to a hospital? Why didn't you call the police? Why did you keep her with you all this time?" The young man raised his eyes, and Michael saw a dignity there he hadn't expected, a quiet strength that didn't match the ragged clothes or the thin, worn-down frame. I did take her to the free clinic on Kinsman the first day. They said they couldn't do much without ID, without family contact. Said she needed a real hospital, but I didn't have money for a cab, didn't have a phone to call anybody. All I had was my 2 hands and this cart, so I brought her back to where I stay. Took care of her the best I could, gave her water, food, cleaned up her cuts, sat with her at night when she cried. And every day I took her with me, because I couldn't leave her alone. She didn't know where she was, didn't know who she was, and I was scared she'd wander off and disappear again. Michael stood there in silence, letting every word sink in, feeling shame and guilt build up inside him, because he had judged this young man in an instant. He had assumed the worst. And now he was learning that the kid he'd just grabbed by the collar in a blind rage was the only person on earth who had helped his mother when she needed it most. "What's your name?" The question came out low, almost a whisper. The young man hesitated before answering. "Marcus. Marcus Webb." Michael ran a hand over his face, trying to gather his thoughts, and looked back down at his mother, whose eyes had drifted shut, her breathing slow, her body slack in the cart. Panic tightened around his chest. "She needs a hospital, now. She needs doctors, tests, treatment. I'm taking her." He lifted her into his arms, feeling how impossibly light she was, how fragile, and carried her to the car. He laid her gently across the back seat, propped her head on a folded jacket, and as he reached to close the door, he heard Marcus's voice behind him. "Sir, is she going to be okay?" Michael turned and saw the young man standing beside the rusted cart, hands gripping the metal, his face full of a worry that was completely genuine. And something inside Michael cracked, because this kid, who had nothing, who survived by collecting cans and bottles off the street, had cared for his mother with more love and devotion than half the wealthy people Michael called friends. "She's going to be okay, I promise you that. And I'm coming back to talk to you, to thank you properly, to do something for you, because you saved her. You understand me? You saved my mother." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes shining with tears he tried to hide by turning his face away. Michael got in the car and pulled off toward the nearest hospital, his heart hammering, his mind flooding with questions he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to answer. How had his mother ended up out there? How had she gotten lost? How had 9 days gone by without anyone finding her? And most of all, what had those 9 days taken from the woman he thought he knew? On the drive to Metro Health, Michael kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching his mother's uneven breathing, her pale, sweat-soaked face, and he pressed harder on the gas, leaned on the horn at every car in front of him, cursed the traffic under his breath and prayed she would hold on, that it wouldn't be too late. Every time she let out a soft moan of pain, his heart broke a little more. He thought back to being a sick kid, how his mother used to stay up all night by his bed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, making him tea, singing softly until he fell asleep. And now it was his turn to take care of her, his turn to be strong. But the truth was he was terrified and completely lost, because seeing the strongest woman he'd ever known reduced to something this fragile, this broken, was something he never imagined he'd have to feel. When he finally reached the hospital, Michael carried his mother straight into the emergency room, shouting for help, and within seconds doctors and nurses surrounded them. They lifted Diane onto a gurney and started firing off questions Michael tried his best to answer, but he didn't know anything. He didn't know where she'd been, what she'd eaten, whether she'd taken any medication, whether she'd hit her head. And the frustration of not having those answers made him feel like the worst son alive. An older nurse, grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked at him with an expression that mixed compassion and urgency and said firmly, "Sir, I need you to calm down. We're going to take care of her, but I need you to wait right out here. It's going to be a little while before we have any updates." Michael wanted to argue, wanted to push through and stay by her side, but he knew there was nothing more he could do in there. So he simply nodded and sank into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting room, hands shaking, body wound tight, eyes locked on the double doors they had wheeled her through. The hours dragged by impossibly slow, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Michael sat there alone, surrounded by other people also waiting for news about someone they loved, but he didn't see any of them, didn't hear any of it. All he could think about was his mother, how she was doing, whether she was in pain, whether she was scared, whether she still remembered him at all. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant, told her to cancel every meeting for the rest of the week, every appointment, because none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except knowing his mother was going to be okay. He thought about calling other relatives, but the truth was, since he'd made his money, most of the people who called themselves family only showed up when they needed something. His mother had always been the one real thing he had, the only person who loved him for who he was, not for what he owned. A doctor in a white coat approached him after nearly 3 hours that felt like they'd lasted days. Her face was serious but gentle, and she asked him to sit, which only made the panic spike higher because he knew that when doctors ask you to sit, it's because they have something heavy to say. "Mr. Carter, your mother is stable now. We're running tests to get a clearer picture, but I can tell you a few things already. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of mental confusion that could stem from a number of causes: trauma, missed medication if she has an underlying condition, or even the sheer stress of being lost and vulnerable for so many days. She'll need to be admitted for observation and treatment. Depending on what the tests show, we may need to bring in a neurologist." Michael nodded, swallowing a knot in his throat that seemed to grow with every word, and asked the only thing that truly mattered in that moment. "Will she be back to normal? Will she remember me? Really remember me?" The doctor sighed, placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture meant to comfort, but that only deepened his anguish, and answered with an honesty that hurt worse than any gentle lie could have. "I can't promise you anything yet. We need more tests, but the brain is complicated. Emotional and physical trauma can cause blocks that are temporary, or in some cases, permanent. Right now, the most important thing is to give her the support she needs, and be patient. Recovery can be slow. It could take weeks, months, or in some cases, it may never be complete. But we're going to do everything we possibly can." Michael felt his knees go weak, and when the doctor walked away, he dropped his head into his hands and finally let the tears fall without holding back, crying right there in the middle of the waiting room, not caring who saw him, because every ounce of pressure from the last 9 days, every bit of fear, every drop of guilt, came pouring out at once, and he couldn't stop it. He sat there a while longer until he managed to pull himself together, wiped his face with the back of his hand, took a few deep breaths, and decided he needed to step out for a few hours. He needed to clear his head. And more than that, he needed to find Marcus again, because there were questions only he could answer, details that might help the doctors understand what had really happened to his mother. Michael left the hospital as the sky was already going dark, his body exhausted but his mind restless. Instead of heading home, he drove back to the corner where he'd found his mother, searching for the cart, for the young man, for Marcus. But there was no one there. The street sat empty and silent, just a few people sleeping under cardboard along the sidewalks. And Michael felt a strange, urgent need to find that kid again, to learn more about him, to understand how someone with absolutely nothing had done so much for a total stranger. He spent the next 3 days splitting his time between the hospital and the streets of that neighborhood, dividing every hour between sitting with his mother, who was still too confused and weak to speak much, and searching for Marcus, asking anyone who might know him. People sleeping rough, other can collectors, shop owners along Kinsman Avenue. Many said they recognized him by sight, said he was quiet, hard-working, never asked anybody for anything, had been on his own since he was young, but nobody knew exactly where he lived. "The boy you're looking for stays back there, in a little shack made of scrap wood way at the end. He's quiet, doesn't bother anybody, just gets by collecting cans and bottles. Sometimes he disappears for days, but when he's around, he's always pushing that old cart." Michael thanked her, handed her a $50 bill that made her eyes go wide, like she'd never held that much cash at once, and walked into the alley, which reeked of garbage and stagnant water, the ground uneven and pitted, the walls of the buildings on either side peeling and stained. And the further he walked, the tighter the knot in his chest grew, because it was hard to believe anyone lived like this. And even harder to believe that someone living like this had still found the strength to help another human being. At the far end of the alley, tucked behind a crumbling cinder block wall, stood the shack, more of a shed, really, made of old warped plywood and mismatched boards, a rusted tin roof full of holes, and a door barely hanging on its hinges, held shut with a twist of wire. Michael knocked softly. The sound echoed weak and hollow. A few seconds later, Marcus opened the door, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes going wide with surprise at the sight of Michael standing there. He froze, unsure what to do, like he couldn't quite believe this man in a suit had actually come back. "Can I come in?" Marcus hesitated, glanced back into the shack like he was embarrassed by what was inside, then stepped aside and let Michael in, into a space so small it could barely hold two people standing, with a thin, torn mattress on the floor, a dented old pot sitting beside a makeshift camp stove, a few pieces of clothing hanging on a wire-strung wall to wall, and nothing else. Absolutely nothing that suggested comfort or safety or dignity. Michael felt his throat tighten again, a lump rising hard, and when he spoke, his voice came out cracked and low. "You took care of my mother while living like this, sleeping here, surviving like this, and you still gave her everything you had." Marcus lowered his head, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his torn shirt, and answered with a simplicity that made Michael's chest ache even more. "It's what I had to give, man. I know it ain't much, but I did the best I could. I shared my food with her, gave her my blanket when she got cold at night, sat with her when she cried and called out for somebody. I couldn't do more than that." Michael stepped forward, feeling the uneven floor shift beneath him, and gripped the young man's shoulders firmly, looking straight into his red, exhausted eyes. "You did more than most people would ever do. You've got a heart worth more than all the money I've ever made, and I came here to tell you something. Starting today, you are never living like this again. I'm going to help you. I'm going to get you a real place to live, a job, a real shot at a better life, because you deserve it, and because it's the least I can do after what you did for my mother, and I'm not taking no for an answer." Marcus blinked, tears sliding down his thin face, cutting clean streaks through the grime, and shook his head, unable to speak at first, overwhelmed by an emotion he clearly wasn't used to feeling. "Man, I don't need charity. I just did what felt right. Anybody would have done the same thing." Michael gave a sad but sincere smile and squeezed his shoulders tighter. "No, Marcus, not just anybody would. Most people would have walked right past, pretended not to see, been too scared to get involved. But not you. You stopped. You took care of her. You gave dignity to someone who was completely lost. And that's not charity. That's gratitude. And if you'll let me, I want you to meet my mother properly once she's better. I want her to know who you are. I want her to thank you herself because you're not a stranger to us. You're the person who saved the most important woman in my life, and I will never forget that." Marcus stood there, tears still running down his face, struggling to process what was happening, because nobody had ever done anything like this for him. Nobody had ever looked at him the way Michael was looking at him now, with respect, with gratitude, with a kind of humanity he simply wasn't used to receiving. When he finally found his voice, it came out shaky and quiet. "Man, I don't even know what to say. Nobody's ever treated me like this. Nobody's ever wanted to help me. I've been on my own since my mum died, when I was 12. Ever since then, it's just been me and this cart, me in the streets. I never expected anything from anybody." Michael felt his chest tighten at those words, picturing the life this young man had lived. How many nights he must have gone hungry, how many days of loneliness, how many times he must have been ignored, humiliated, treated like he was invisible. And still, somehow, he had held onto a kindness inside himself that most people who had everything could never manage to find. "Then let me help you now. Let me give you at least a shot at something better. You deserve it, Marcus. You deserve so much more than this." Michael looked around the shack one more time, taking in every detail of that extreme poverty, and made a decision right there on the spot. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant, asking her to book a decent hotel room near the hospital, somewhere Marcus could stay while he sorted out something more permanent. Then he hung up and looked back at the young man, who still seemed unable to believe what was happening. "Grab your things. You're getting out of here right now. You'll stay somewhere better while I handle the rest. And tomorrow we'll talk about work, about what you want to do, about where we go from here." Marcus looked at the old mattress, the dented pot, the few clothes he owned, and realized he barely had anything to pack. He grabbed a beat-up backpack from the corner, tucked in the 2 shirts still worth keeping, and a faded photograph of his mother that he'd kept like a treasure, and nodded, ready to follow Michael wherever he was headed, because for the first time in his life, he felt like maybe things could actually be different. On the drive to the hotel, Marcus stayed quiet, staring out the window at the lit-up streets, the tall buildings, the people hurrying along the sidewalks, all things that had always been part of his world, but seen now from a completely different angle, because he'd only ever known that world from the outside looking in. Now he was sitting inside an air-conditioned car with leather seats, breathing in the smell of something new, and it was strange, almost frightening, but also good in a way he couldn't quite put into words. Michael glanced over and caught the mix of fear and hope on the young man's face, and decided to break the silence. "Marcus, I wanted to ask you something. When you found my mother, did she say anything? Any name, any place, anything that might help me understand how she ended up out there?" Marcus thought for a moment, brow furrowed in concentration, then answered slowly, trying to recall every detail. "She said a lot of confused stuff, man. Sometimes it seemed like she was talking to somebody who wasn't even there. She kept saying your name over and over, and she talked about some kind of party, about getting lost, but none of it ever really came together. It was all jumbled up in her head." Michael nodded, letting that settle, and suddenly a memory surfaced. The last time he'd seen his mother before she disappeared had been at a charity gala he'd organized downtown at the Ritz-Carlton, raising money for the local children's hospital. He remembered she'd left early because she was feeling tired, said she'd grab a cab and head home, but she never made it. That was the night the nightmare began, calling every hospital, every police precinct, driving the entire city block by block without finding a single trace of her. And now, finally, he understood. She had gotten lost that night, somehow ended up far from home, confused, alone, and nobody had helped her. Nobody, until Marcus. She left a gala early, got in a cab that should have taken her straight home, and something went wrong. I'll never know exactly what, whether the driver dropped her at the wrong address, whether she got out too soon by mistake, whether somebody did something to her, but what matters is that you found her. You saved her when she needed it most. Michael paused, took a breath, and continued, his voice steadier now. "You know, Marcus, I spent 9 days looking for her. 9 days barely sleeping, barely eating, thinking I'd lost her for good, and when I finally found her with you, I had all these terrible thoughts, all these wrong assumptions. Now I see how wrong I was and how we judge people by how they look, by what they have or don't have, and forget to look at the heart, forget to see what actually matters." Marcus turned to look at him, eyes still wet, and said something that caught Michael completely off guard. "Man, I get why you reacted like that. I get why you were mad at me at first. If it was my mom, I'd have reacted the same way. Any son would. You don't need to feel bad about it. What matters is it worked out. She's alive and she's going to be okay." Those simple but profound words made Michael realize just how much emotional maturity this young man carried. Barely 20 years old, but speaking with the wisdom of someone who had lived through far more. Someone who had learned through pain, through struggle, through daily survival, and who still somehow carried no bitterness, no resentment, just moved forward with a quiet, admirable dignity. When they reached the hotel, Michael walked Marcus up to his room, simple but clean, a real bed, a bathroom with hot water, a TV mounted on the wall, fresh towels folded neatly on the comforter. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, staring at all of it like it was a palace, because to him it was. He'd never slept anywhere like this, never had a soft pillow, never taken a hot shower that wasn't from a park spigot or a public restroom sink. "Make yourself at home. Take a shower, get some rest, order whatever you want from room service. It's all covered. Eat what you like, sleep well, and I'll come back tomorrow morning so we can talk things through, plan out the next steps. Sound good?" Marcus only nodded, his voice caught somewhere in his throat, too full of emotion to speak. When Michael left and the door clicked shut, Marcus sat down on the bed, sank into the soft mattress, ran his hand over the clean sheets that smelled like fresh laundry, and cried. He cried the way he hadn't cried since he was a little boy. He cried out of relief, out of gratitude, out of fear that he'd wake up and find out it had all been a dream, fear that the hard life he knew would suddenly come crashing back and take it all away again. He sat there for a stretch of time he couldn't measure, letting the tears fall freely, releasing years of weight from his body. Eventually he stood up on shaky legs, walked into the small but clean bathroom, white tile and unbroken mirror, a shower that actually worked, turned the water on, adjusted the temperature, and as the warm water ran down over him, Marcus closed his eyes and felt like he wasn't just washing dirt off his skin. He was washing away the pain, the sorrow, all the abandonment he'd carried for so long. Meanwhile, Michael went back to the hospital, up to his mother's room, and found her awake, sitting up in bed, staring out the window, with an expression that was distant but more present than it had been in days. When she turned and saw him walk in, a weak but genuine smile crossed her face, and this time there was recognition in it. That familiar glow was back, the look only a mother has when she sees her son. "Michael, my boy, you're back again." Her voice was still weak, but it was hers, his mother's voice. Michael crossed the room quickly and sat carefully on the edge of the bed so as not to jostle her, taking her hand, which was still cool but no longer as cold as before. "I've been here the whole time, Mum, and I'm not going anywhere. You're getting better, you're remembering more." Diane nodded slowly, squeezed her son's hand back, and her eyes filled with tears that slipped silently down her wrinkled cheeks. "I remember bits and pieces. I remember being lost, being scared, not knowing where I was, people walking past me without even seeing me, without helping. I remember being cold, so thirsty, and a young man who stopped, who picked me up off the ground, took me somewhere, but there's still a lot that's foggy. It's like a bad dream that won't fully go away." Michael squeezed her hand harder, feeling warmth slowly returning, feeling her come back to him in pieces, fragments he knew he'd need patience to put back together. "You don't have to force it, Mom. What matters is you're safe now. You're being taken care of by the best doctors in the city, and I'm here. I'll always be here. And there's something else. That young man you remember, the one who helped you. His name is Marcus, and I found him. I've already gotten him settled somewhere better. And when you're ready, when the doctors say it's okay, I'm bringing him here so you can meet him properly, so you can thank him yourself." Diane's eyes went wide, more tears falling, and she pressed her free hand to her chest. "I want to meet him, Michael. I want to so badly, because I know that if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here right now. I feel it in my heart." They sat there talking for hours. Michael told her more about Marcus, about the shack he'd been living in, about how he'd shared his food with her, about how he'd cared for her without expecting a single thing in return. And Diane listened closely, tears never fully stopping. And at one point she interrupted her son and said something that stayed with Michael for the rest of his life. "That boy has the kind of heart the world needs, the kind most people have lost. And if there's anything you can do for him, do all of it. Give him everything you can because he's earned it, because people like that are rare. They're gifts life gives us." Over the following days, Diane's health improved considerably. The test results showed no permanent brain damage. The confusion had been caused by severe dehydration, malnutrition, and extreme stress. And with proper treatment, rest, and nutrition, she would make a full recovery. The doctors told Michael she'd been incredibly lucky. If she'd gone even a few more days without care, the outcome could have been tragic. After a week and a half, she was discharged, and Michael brought her home to the house he lived in alone since striking it rich. A sprawling place out past Shaker Heights, with gardens and a pool and more bedrooms than he'd ever needed. A house that had always felt hollow and cold, and that now, finally, would have her presence in it again. The one person who made that place feel like an actual home, the only one who turned those walls into something worth calling that. Michael also kept every promise he'd made to Marcus, and did far more than he'd promised. He found him a small but dignified apartment in a safe, working-class neighborhood, 2 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, a full bathroom, everything clean and everything working. He furnished it completely: new bed, couch, table, refrigerator, stove, filled the fridge and cabinets with groceries, left money for the first round of bills, and handed Marcus the keys on a day he would never forget. Marcus walked into that apartment with his hands trembling, looked into every room with wide eyes, touched the walls like he needed to confirm it was real. He sat on the couch and sank into the cushions. He walked into the bedroom and saw the bed made up with new sheets, soft pillows, a closet full of new clothes hanging inside. And when he came back out to the living room, he dropped to his knees and cried in a way that startled Michael, deep sobs that shook his whole thin frame. Michael knelt beside him, put a hand on his back and let him cry it all out, because he understood those tears weren't just joy. They were release, years of pain finally being acknowledged, a lifetime of struggle finally being met with dignity. Beyond the apartment, Michael offered Marcus a job at his company, starting as an assistant in the logistics department. Nothing too complicated at first, inventory tasks, organizing shipments, supporting the supervisors, but with a promise that if Marcus wanted to study, wanted to grow, every door would be open to him. He could take courses paid for by the company, have mentors, move up as he proved himself. Marcus accepted it all with a humility and gratitude that moved Michael every single day, and he worked with a dedication that impressed everyone at the office. He showed up 30 minutes early without fail. He stayed after everyone else had gone home. He learned every task with the focus of someone who refused to waste the opportunity he'd been given. He treated the janitor and the executives with the exact same respect and kindness, and it wasn't long before his supervisors were praising him, holding him up as an example of a committed employee, proving that he deserved every bit of the chance he'd been given, and then some. Michael watched it all unfold from a distance, feeling a pride he never expected to feel for someone outside his own family. And he noticed how the other employees, who had eyed Marcus with suspicion and quiet judgment when they first learned where he'd come from, slowly began to respect him, to admire him, to recognize that this young man carried something special, an inner strength, a work ethic, a genuine kindness that can't be bought and can't be taught. It simply exists, or it doesn't. Then came the day Diane, fully recovered now, asked to finally meet Marcus in person, to thank him face to face, to look him in the eye and say what had been sitting in her heart ever since the fragments of those terrible days had started coming back to her. Michael arranged a lunch at his house, a simple gathering but heavy with meaning, just the three of them, no one else, because that moment belonged only to them. It was sacred. It was the closing of a circle that had begun in pain but was ending in love. When Marcus arrived, dressed neatly in new clothes Michael had bought him, dress pants, a button-down shirt, clean shoes, his hair freshly cut, he still carried that same shy, uncertain manner, like someone who hadn't quite adjusted to his new reality. Diane was sitting in the living room waiting, and when she saw him walk through the door, she rose from her chair faster than anyone thought a woman her age could move. She crossed the room with steps that felt steadier than they had in weeks, and without saying a word, she pulled him into a hug so tight, so full of everything she couldn't put into words, that it startled even Michael. "Thank you, my boy. Thank you for saving me, for taking care of me when I needed it most, for not leaving me alone, for treating me like a person when I was lost, for giving me food when you barely had enough for yourself, for sharing your roof when you barely had a roof to share, for holding my hand when I cried. Thank you for all of it." Marcus hugged her back, arms wrapping around that small, frail woman who somehow at the same time felt so strong. The tears came again, soaking into her shoulder, and he answered in a broken, trembling voice. "You don't have to thank me, Mrs. Carter. I just did what anybody with a heart would have done. I couldn't leave you out there alone, I just couldn't." Diane pulled back a little, cupped his face in both hands and looked straight into his eyes, red and full of tears, and spoke with a firmness that came from somewhere deep inside her. "No, my boy. You did far more than that. You treated me with dignity when I had nothing left, when I was lost and scared and confused, when I didn't even know who I was. You were my light. You were my angel, and I will never forget that. Not as long as I live." They ate lunch together, a meal prepared by Michael's cook but served by their own hands. No formality, no distance between them. Just three people that fate had brought together through pain, now sitting there like family. They talked about everything, about Marcus's life before all of this, about a childhood that had been far too hard for a child, about the mother he lost too soon, about how he'd survived on the streets, about the dreams he'd carried, but had always felt were impossible. Diane and Michael listened to every word with attention, with respect, with genuine interest. And when Marcus finished telling his story, Diane took his hand across the table and said something that changed everything. "You are not alone anymore, Marcus. Now you have us. You have this small but real family. And as long as I'm alive, you will always have somewhere to come back to. You will always have people who care about you. You will always have love." Marcus couldn't answer. He only squeezed her hand back and cried again, but this time they were different tears. Tears of someone who had finally found what he'd been searching for his whole life, without even realizing he was searching for it. A place to belong, people to love and be loved by in return. Be loved by. The months that followed changed all three of their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. Diane made a full recovery. Her memory came back almost entirely. She started smiling that smile again, the one that used to light up any room she walked into. She went back to cooking the meals Michael had loved since childhood. She filled the house with life again. And she started treating Marcus like a second son, always asking how he was doing, whether he was eating well, whether he was happy at work, whether he needed anything. And Marcus, who hadn't had a real mother figure since losing his own so young, found in Diane a kind of maternal warmth he thought he'd never feel again. A shoulder for the hard days, a voice of guidance, a presence that made him feel like he mattered. Michael watched all of it unfold, with his heart full of a gratitude he couldn't fully put into words, because he had learned a lesson he would never forget. That money means nothing without humanity, that the most valuable people are often found in the most unexpected places, hidden behind torn clothes and dirt-streaked faces, and that true kindness doesn't care about social class or financial status. It simply exists in people with pure hearts, people who, even with nothing, still find a way to give. Marcus started taking night classes to finish his GED, which he'd had to abandon when his mother died, and Michael paid for everything, the books, the tuition, the transportation, whatever Marcus needed for a real shot at growing, at becoming more, at reaching the dreams he'd buried deep in his heart for years, with no hope of ever reaching them. Marcus studied with a discipline that amazed everyone around him. He stayed up late finishing assignments, woke up early to review material before work, and in less than a year, he'd earned his diploma with honors. Michael was there at the ceremony, sitting beside Diane, both of them clapping with tears in their eyes as Marcus walked across the stage to receive his certificate. And in that moment, Michael felt certain he had done the right thing, that he had honored the second chance life had given both him and his mother. A year after that day on the street corner, the moment that changed everything, Michael threw a party. Not one of the business events he usually hosted, packed with people he barely knew, full of empty small talk and forced smiles, but a small, intimate family gathering at his house, and he invited Marcus, his mother, and a handful of people who actually mattered, who were actually part of his real life. In the middle of the party, with everyone gathered in the living room, Michael asked for everyone's attention, tapped his wine glass with a spoon, and when the room went quiet, he began to speak. His voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I want to make a toast, but first I need to say a few things. A year ago I was a man who thought he had it all, money, success, recognition, but I was wrong because I didn't have the most important thing. I didn't have humility. I didn't have real empathy. I judged people by how they looked, by what they had or didn't have, and I almost lost the most important person in my life because of my own arrogance. But life taught me a lesson. It scared me awake. And when I thought I'd lost everything, when I found my mother in that cart being cared for by a young man I didn't even know, I learned the true meaning of kindness. I met someone who taught me that being a hero doesn't require a cape, doesn't require recognition, doesn't require anything except the courage to do what's right when no one is watching. Marcus, you saved my mother. But you saved me too. You saved me from becoming an empty person. You taught me to see the world differently, and I will never be able to thank you enough for that." Everyone applauded. Marcus flushed red with embarrassment and emotion, tried to hide his face, lowered his head, but Diane, sitting beside him, took his hand firmly, pulled him closer, and whispered just for him to hear, though every word landed deep in his soul. "You deserve every bit of this love, my boy. You deserve it and so much more. You're special. You're rare, and I thank God every single day that you walked into my life, not just for saving me, but for showing me that goodness still exists in this world, that there are still truly good people out there." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house had gone quiet again, Michael stood alone on the back porch, looking up at a clear, star-filled sky, thinking about everything that had happened, about how life had thrown a curveball he never saw coming, about how losing his mother for those terrible days had been the worst nightmare of his life, but had also been the very thing that brought Marcus into their lives, that showed him what actually mattered. That made him question everything he thought he understood about value, about success, about what it truly means to be rich. His mother stepped out beside him without a sound, rested her hand gently on his shoulder, and they stood there in silence for a few minutes, just looking at the stars until she finally spoke, her voice soft and soothing, the way it had always been, ever since he was a little boy. "You've become the man I always dreamed you'd be, not because of the money, not because of the success, but because you learned how to truly see people, to value those who deserve it, to use what you have to make a real difference in someone's life. And that makes me prouder than any business achievement ever could." Michael looked over at her, eyes shining with tears he didn't bother hiding. "I learned that from you, Mum. Everything good in me I owe to you. You're the one who taught me right from wrong, taught me what really matters." Diane smiled, that same smile that used to light up her whole face, the one Michael had spent 9 terrifying days believing he might never see again, and answered with the wisdom of someone who had lived a long life and learned even more from it. "No, my boy. You learned that from life, and from that remarkable young man life put in our path exactly when we needed him most. That boy with the enormous heart who had nothing and still gave everything, and now he's part of our family, for good." And there on that quiet, perfect night, under a sky full of stars that seemed to shine just a little brighter for the three of them, Michael understood with a clarity he'd never had before that the true meaning of finding someone isn't about the place, isn't about circumstance, isn't about plans or coincidence. It's about recognizing the light in people, even when everything around them looks dark. It's about valuing kindness, even when it comes wrapped in torn clothes and hands worn rough from working just to survive. And it's about never forgetting that a pure heart, a heart that loves without expecting anything in return, is worth infinitely more than all the riches in the world. Because wealth can be lost, it can be stolen, it can vanish overnight without warning. But kindness, gratitude, and real love stay with you forever, carved into the soul of anyone lucky enough to experience them, to feel them, to live them. And that is the only inheritance that truly matters, the only thing we take with us when it's all over, the memory of having loved and been loved, of having helped and been helped, of having made a difference in someone's life, and of having let someone make a difference in yours. Because in the end, when everything else fades, when every material achievement loses its meaning, what remains and what truly defines who we were are the bonds we built, the lives we touched, the hearts we warmed. And Michael knew now with absolute certainty that Marcus had warmed his heart, and his mother's heart in a way no business success ever could, and that was the greatest wealth he would ever have, the wealth of finding, in the most unlikely place, under the hardest circumstances, living proof that humanity still exists, that kindness still holds on, that love still wins. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. I want to hear what part hit you the hardest, and if you believe there are still good people out there like Marcus, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs a reminder today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. See you in the next one.